The stale air of room 509 held the faint scent of cigarettes, a ghostly residue clinging to the heavy drapes that swallowed the meager light filtering in from the city below. Kawa's fingers traced the worn velvet of the armchair, the texture a stark contrast to the icy knot in her stomach. 12 years. 12 years of unanswered questions, of a gnawing emptiness that no amount of forced normalcy could fill. Across from her, Lu Zhijian sat bathed in shadows, his presence as imposing as the darkness that cloaked him. He was a man woven from whispers and rumors, a figure whose power radiated outward like the oppressive humidity of a summer night. She'd heard tales, of course. Stories of his influence, of his ruthlessness. Stories that made her palms sweat and her breath catch in her throat. But desperation was a powerful motivator, a relentless force that could push a person to the brink, to the edge of a precipice where the fall was terrifying and the potential reward, the glimmer of hope, was all that mattered. The person sitting on the throne, Kahwa began, her voice barely above a whisper, each word a carefully placed stone on the precarious bridge she was building. She watched his eyes, twin embers glowing in the dim light, searching for a flicker of recognition, a sign that he understood the weight of her words. The person sitting on the throne is the person I'm talking about. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Had she said too much? Revealed too much too soon? The silence that stretched between them felt heavy, suffocating. Lu Zhijian's gaze was unwavering, a predator assessing its prey. He took a slow drag from his cigarette, the tip flaring a vibrant orange, momentarily illuminating the sharp angles of his face. Kahwa's internal monologue was a chaotic swirl of anxieties. Was he amused? Dismissive? Or something else entirely, something colder, more calculating? The smoke curled upwards, dissipating into the still air, taking with it a small piece of her composure. Jiang Huai, he finally said, the name a low rumble in his chest. He knew. Of course, he knew. He knew everything. The realization sent a shiver down her spine, a strange mixture of fear and relief. I've been waiting for this news for 12 years, she confessed, the words tumbling out in a rush, a dam finally breaking after years of holding back the torrent of her emotions. 12 years of pretending, of burying the pain, the confusion, the burning injustice of it all. 12 years of watching her mother's slow descent into despair, a fragile ghost haunted by fragmented memories and a grief so profound it threatened to consume her entirely. Kahwa closed her eyes, the image of her mother's vacant stare, her listless hands, a constant ache in her heart. 12 years, she repeated, the words a raw, open wound. Lu Zhijian stubbed out his cigarette in a crystal ashtray, the sharp click echoing in the silence. And what makes you think I can help you? His voice was smooth, almost gentle, but Kahwa could sense the steel beneath the velvet. The unspoken question hung in the air, what do you have to offer? Kahwa opened her eyes, her gaze meeting his with a newfound resolve. I'm willing to pay anything, she stated, her voice firm, unwavering. The words felt reckless, dangerous, but they were also true. She would sacrifice anything, everything, to uncover the truth about her father's imprisonment, to bring solace to her shattered family. The thought of Zhang Tianji, his sneering face, his condescending tone, flashed through her mind. A bitter taste rose in her throat. She could play their games. She could navigate their world of privilege and deceit. She had to. A slow smile spread across Lu Zhijian's face, a predatory gleam in his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, the movement almost languid, and yet it exuded an aura of power, of control. Anything, he repeated, his voice laced with a hint of amusement. He knew her desperation. He knew her vulnerability. And he was going to exploit it. Kahwa's stomach clenched. She knew what he was thinking. The rumors, the whispers, they painted a vivid picture of the man before her. A man who took what he wanted, a man who played by his own rules. But she held his gaze, refusing to flinch. She had already made her decision. There was no turning back. Yes, she affirmed, her voice barely a whisper, but filled with a steel he hadn't expected. Anything. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken promises and hidden dangers. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, taut and thick with anticipation. Then, he spoke, his voice low and resonant, Lin Zixuan. Find her. The name was unfamiliar, a puzzle piece she didn't recognize. Confusion warred with determination in her mind. Who was this woman? And what connection did she have to her father's case? Who is she? Kahwa asked, the question escaping before she could stop herself. That, Lu Zizhan said, a cryptic smile playing on his lips, is for you to discover. He rose from his chair, his towering figure casting an even longer shadow in the dim light. He moved towards her, stopping just inches away. Kahwa could feel the heat radiating from his body, the subtle scent of his cologne, a mixture of sandalwood and something darker, more intoxicating. He leaned down, his voice a low murmur against her ear, I will find your father, Kahwa. And when I do, you will be mine. The word sent a jolt of electricity through her, a strange mixture of fear and anticipation. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. He wasn't talking about a transaction anymore. This was something else, something deeper, more dangerous. I've waited a long time for you, Kahwa, he whispered, his gaze intense, unwavering. And I won't let you go. He straightened, leaving her breathless, her mind reeling from the implications of his words. He turned to leave, pausing at the door. Don't disappoint me, Kahwa, he said, his voice a low growl. I have high hopes for you. And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the dimly lit room, the silence now heavier, more oppressive than before. Kahwa sat there for a long time, the echoes of his words reverberating in her mind. Fear, confusion, and a strange flicker of excitement warred within her. She had made a deal with the devil. And she had a feeling the price would be far higher than she could ever imagine. But she would pay it. She had to. For her father. For her mother. For herself. The cold, metallic clang of the prison gates echoed in 12-year-old Kahwa's ears, a sound that would forever be etched into her memory. The guards, impassive and indifferent, led her father away, his back ramrod straight, his head held high, yet Kahwa saw the tremor in his hand as he waved goodbye. He hadn't looked at her, not directly, but she felt the weight of his gaze, heavy with unspoken words, unspoken promises. He'll be back, she told herself fiercely, clinging to the thin thread of hope. He promised. But the prison walls, tall and imposing, seemed to mock her childish faith. The following days were a blur of hushed whispers and furtive glances. Her mother, once vibrant and full of life, withered like a flower deprived of sunlight. The whispers turned to accusations, the glances to open disdain. Their once comfortable life, filled with laughter and warmth, was now shrouded in a suffocating silence, punctuated only by her mother's choked sobs. Kahwa remembered the way her mother's hands, once soft and gentle, now trembled as she held a chipped teacup, the porcelain a stark white against her bloodless fingers. The scent of jasmine tea, once a comforting aroma, now carried the bitter tang of despair. Kahwa found herself navigating a world suddenly hostile, a world that saw her not as a child grieving the loss of her father, but as the daughter of a criminal. The taunts at school, the averted gazes of neighbors, the pitying looks from once friendly faces, they chipped away at her fragile sense of self. It's not true, she would chant in her mind, a desperate mantra against the rising tide of doubt. My father isn't a criminal. But the seed of uncertainty had been planted, and it grew, twisting its roots deep into her heart. One night, Kahwa awoke to the muffled cries coming from her mother's room. She found her huddled in the corner, clutching a bottle of pills, her eyes wide and vacant. The scent of antiseptic filled the air, sharp and stinging. The memory of that night, the frantic call for an ambulance, the sterile white of the hospital room, became another scar etched onto Kawa's soul. Her mother survived, but a part of her was lost, replaced by a haunting emptiness. The doctors spoke of depression, of trauma, of a mind struggling to cope. But Kawa knew the truth. It was the weight of their shattered world, the crushing burden of shame and uncertainty, that had driven her mother to the brink. Years passed, marked by her mother's recurring breakdowns and Kawa's relentless struggle to maintain a semblance of normalcy. She buried herself in her studies, excelling in school, driven by a need to prove herself, to escape the shadow of her father's disgrace. But beneath the veneer of composure, a fire burned within her, a fierce determination to uncover the truth, to clear her father's name, and to reclaim the life that had been stolen from them. The flashbacks blurred, shifting to a sterile courtroom, the judge's voice a monotonous drone, the gavel a final, devastating blow. Embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy, the words hung in the air, heavy with condemnation. Jiang Huai, her father, stood stoic, his expression unreadable. The air hung thick with the perfume of orchids and the murmur of polite conversation, a symphony of expensive fabric rustling against expensive fabric. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto the polished marble floor, reflecting in the champagne flutes held loosely in manicured hands. Kahua felt a tremor of unease, the opulent surroundings a stark contrast to the cramped, sterile environment of her father's prison. Lu Zhizhan, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that seemed to absorb the light, stood beside her, a glass of amber liquid swirling in his hand. His presence, usually a source of both intrigue and apprehension, tonight felt like a shield against the curious glances thrown her way. He hadn't explained why he'd brought her here, to this gathering of Shanghai's elite, only that it was a distraction. The word echoed in her mind, hollow and unsettling. A distraction from what? From the gnawing uncertainty of her father's fate? From the unsettling intimacy of their earlier encounter? The memory of his lips on hers, a fleeting moment of heat against the cold calculation of their agreement, sent a shiver down her spine. He turned to her, his gaze sharp and assessing, as if gauging her reaction to the opulent display. "Enjoying the view?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that cut through the ambient noise. Kahua forced a smile, a brittle, fragile thing. "It's impressive," she admitted, her gaze sweeping over the room. Impressive, yes, but also alienating. She felt like an intruder, a moth drawn to a flame that could just as easily consume her. "He brought me here to remind me of my place," she thought, the realization a bitter pill. "To show me the world I can never truly belong to, not without his help." "Today's kiss," he said, his words a soft counterpoint to the clinking glasses and forced laughter, was a deposit. His eyes held hers, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. "You'll see him. That's a promise." He paused, swirling the liquid in his glass again. "You come with me. Consider it a distraction." Kahua's breath hitched. Seeing her father, the thought was a physical ache, a desperate yearning that had consumed her for 12 long years. But the price, the weight of his gaze, the implication of their bargain, pressed down on her. A distraction, she thought, the word a bitter taste on her tongue. "He thinks he can buy my compliance, my silence, with a fleeting glimpse of my father." But what choice did she have? She was caught in his web, a spider silk promise holding her captive. "A distraction," she echoed, her voice barely a whisper, the word a question hanging in the air. He didn't answer, merely offered her his arm, a silent command. As she took it, the warmth of his skin against hers sent a jolt of awareness through her. This man, with his enigmatic smile and his dangerous charm, held her fate in his hands. He was her only hope, and yet, he was also a potential threat. The dichotomy left her breathless, a tight knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. They moved through the crowd, Lu Zizhan navigating the social currents with effortless grace. Introductions were made, names and titles washed over Kahua, a meaningless stream of syllables. She felt a phantom pressure on her ring finger, a reminder of the lie she was living, the charade she was playing. She saw Zhang Tianji across the room, his eyes narrowed, a predatory gleam in their depths. His presence was a jarring reminder of the other threat looming over her, a constant, buzzing irritation. He knows something, she thought, the certainty settling in her bones. He knows something about my father, about me. Lu Zizhan, sensing her unease, tightened his grip on her arm. Don't worry about him, he murmured, his voice low and reassuring. He's just a spoiled brat playing games. His words, meant to comfort, only served to heighten her anxiety. He underestimates him, she thought, her gaze still fixed on Zhang Tianji. He doesn't understand the depths of his malice. Later, as they stood on a balcony overlooking the city lights, the cool night air a welcome reprieve from the stifling atmosphere inside, Lu Zizhan turned to her, his expression softening. Tell me about your father, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. The question caught her off guard. She had expected more bartering, more veiled threats, not this vulnerability. What do you want to know? She asked, her voice guarded. Everything, he replied, his gaze steady. Tell me about the man he was, before, and so, she did. She spoke of her father, the brilliant engineer, the loving husband, the devoted father. She spoke of their life before the scandal, before the arrest, before their world crumbled around them. She spoke of her mother's descent into despair, her repeated suicide attempts, the fragments of memory lost to trauma. As she spoke, the dam of her grief began to crack, the years of suppressed emotions threatening to spill over. He listened intently, his expression unreadable, absorbing every word, every nuance. When she finished, a silence fell between them, broken only by the distant hum of the city. He's a good man, she whispered, the conviction in her voice unwavering. He nodded slowly. I believe you, he said, his voice soft. Then, he did something unexpected. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. Kahua, he said, his voice husky with emotion, I promise you, I will find out the truth. And when I do, he paused, his eyes searching hers, we'll face it together. His words, so simple yet so profound, resonated deep within her. We, she thought, the word echoing in her mind. He had included her, not as a pawn in his game, but as a partner. Why? She asked, the question a trembling whisper. Why are you doing this for me? He leaned closer, his breath warm against her skin. Because, he said, his voice barely audible above the city's hum, he hesitated, as if struggling to find the right words. I care for you, Kahua. More than I should. The confession hung in the air, fragile and unexpected. Kahua stared at him, her mind reeling. Care. Was it possible? Could this powerful, enigmatic man truly care for her, for the broken daughter of a disgraced engineer? Or was it just another manipulation, another layer of his intricate game? He lowered his head, his lips brushing against her forehead. We have a future, Kahua, he whispered, his voice filled with a strange mixture of tenderness and determination. A future together. His words, a promise and a threat all at once, echoed in the stillness of the night. Kahua closed her eyes, the city lights blurring into a kaleidoscope of color. She was adrift, caught in a current she couldn't control, swept along by the force of his will. And for the first time in a long time, a flicker of hope, fragile and uncertain, ignited within her. But beneath the hope, a cold fear lingered. What would this future cost her? And what secrets would it reveal? The strobe lights pulsed, a frantic heartbeat against the plush velvet walls of the KTV room. The air, thick with the cloying sweetness of cheap perfume and cigarette smoke, clung to Kawa's skin like a second layer. Each thump of the bass seemed to reverberate not just through the room, but through her very bones, a physical echo of the tension coiling in her stomach. She hadn't come here for the music, for the gaudy spectacle of flashing lights and swirling bodies. She had come for Zhang Tianji. He was sprawled on a sofa, surrounded by his usual entourage, a pack of sycophants mirroring his every sneer and laugh. A bottle of expensive champagne sat precariously perched on the edge of the low table, a symbol of the careless arrogance that radiated from him. Kahwa watched him from the doorway, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. He was everything she despised: entitled, cruel, and oblivious to the pain he inflicted on others. The memory of his sneering face at the wedding, the casual insult that had sliced through her like a knife, still burned fresh in her mind. Taking a deep breath, she pushed her way through the throng of bodies, each step a deliberate act of defiance. The music seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the pounding of her own heart. "Don't hesitate," she told herself. "Don't show any weakness." She had spent 12 years hardened by loss and fueled by a burning need for justice. Tonight, she would finally confront the man who had added another layer of humiliation to her already heavy burden. "Zhang Tianji," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like shattered glass. He looked up, his eyes momentarily glazed with drunken indifference before recognition flickered within them. A smirk spread across his face. "Well, well, well. If it isn't the little firecracker from the wedding. What brings you to my humble abode?" His words dripped with sarcasm, and Kahwa could feel the familiar prickle of anger rising in her chest. "Stay calm," she reminded herself, her grip tightening on the strap of her purse. "This isn't about anger. This is about getting what you need." "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice deceptively level. "Oh, you do you?" he drawled, leaning back against the sofa, his eyes raking over her with an insolent gaze. "And what makes you think I have time for you?" The urge to slap the smirk off his face was almost overwhelming, but Kahwa held herself back. "Patience," she thought. "Just a little longer." "It's about my father," she said, the words laced with a carefully controlled edge. The mention of her father seemed to have an unexpected effect on Zhang Tianji. His smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease. "What about him?" he asked, his voice losing some of its swagger. "He's in prison because of your family," Kahwa said, her gaze unwavering. The room seemed to hold its breath, the pulsating music suddenly a distant hum. Zhang Tianji laughed, a short, sharp sound that lacked any genuine mirth. "Don't be ridiculous," he said, but there was a tremor in his voice that Kahwa didn't miss. "Your father is in prison because he's a criminal." "He's innocent," Kahwa insisted, her voice rising despite her efforts to control it. The carefully constructed wall of composure she had built around herself began to crumble. "And I know you know it." Zhang Tianji stood up, his face flushed with anger. He swayed slightly, his movements clumsy with alcohol. "You're playing a dangerous game, little girl," he slurred, stepping closer to her. "I'm not afraid of you," Kahwa retorted, refusing to back down. He lunged at her, his hand raised as if to strike her. Kahwa braced herself for the impact, but it never came. A hand, strong and firm, caught Zhang Tianji's wrist mid-air. "That's enough, Tianji," a voice said, calm and authoritative. Kahwa turned to see Lin Zixuan standing beside her, his expression unreadable. His intervention was unexpected, a sudden shift in the tense dynamic of the room. He held Zhang Tianji's gaze for a moment, a silent battle of wills passing between them. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he released Zhang Tianji's arm, sending him stumbling back onto the sofa. The air crackled with unspoken tension. Kahwa stared at Lin Zixuan, a whirlwind of questions swirling in her mind. Why was he here? Why did he intervene? What was his connection to her, to this whole tangled mess? His presence felt both reassuring and unsettling, a new variable in an equation she was only beginning to understand. He turned to her, his gaze softening. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and concerned. Kahwa nodded, still reeling from the sudden turn of events. "I'm fine," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. Lin Zixuan's eyes held hers for a long moment, a flicker of something unreadable passing between them. Then, he turned back to Zhang Tianji, his expression hardening once more. "Leave her alone," he said, his voice cold and sharp. "Or you'll answer to me." The muted gray of Lu Zhizhan's office seemed to amplify the silence, a silence thick with unspoken words and half-formed suspicions. He sat across from her, a fortress of composure behind the expanse of his polished desk, the city sprawling beneath the panoramic window, a muted backdrop to the drama unfolding between them. He pushed a thin manila folder across the gleaming surface. "Everything you need to know is in there." His voice, like always, was a low rumble, a tremor in the stillness. Kahwa's fingers, cold despite the warmth of the room, hesitated above the folder. 12 years. 12 years of unanswered questions, of a gnawing void where the truth should have been. This folder, she knew, held the key, but the lock it would open might unleash a storm she wasn't prepared for. Taking a shaky breath, she opened it. The documents inside were a chaotic jumble of official reports, financial records, and court transcripts. They danced before her eyes, a dizzying whirlwind of legalese and numbers. Sealed files. Missing funds. The words swam, each one a sharp jab at the carefully constructed narrative she'd held onto for so long. Her father, a man imprisoned for embezzlement, a man she believed was wrongly accused. The foundation of her world, built on a bedrock of faith in his innocence, now trembled precariously. "The money, it's gone." Her voice was barely a whisper, lost in the vastness of the office. Lu Zhizhan watched her, his gaze unreadable. "Vanished." Along with any clear evidence of what truly happened. The cold, sterile environment of the prison visiting room was a stark contrast to the opulent setting she'd just left. The thick plexiglass separating her from her father felt like an insurmountable barrier, a physical manifestation of the chasm that had grown between them over the years. Jiang Huai, his face etched with the weariness of years spent behind bars, looked smaller, more fragile than she remembered. They told me sealed files, missing money, the words tumbled out, a torrent of confusion and accusation. He flinched, a flicker of pain in his eyes. "Kahwa, there are things you wouldn't understand." "Understand?" The word echoed in a small, confined space. "I've spent 12 years trying to understand. 12 years believing in you, fighting for you." Her voice cracked, the carefully constructed composure she'd maintained shattering into a million pieces. He looked away, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond her shoulder. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the muffled sounds of other inmates and visitors. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible above the low hum of the prison's ventilation system. "It wasn't just the money, Kahwa. There was someone else." He closed his eyes, the confession wrenched from him like a physical pain. Infidelity. Another blow, another crack in the foundation of her world. The image of her mother, frail and broken, haunted by the ghost of her husband's betrayal, flashed through her mind. The endless cycle of suicide attempts, the fragmented memories, the vacant stares. The city lights bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting streaks of neon across the polished hardwood floor of Lu Zhizhan's apartment. Kahwa sat perched on the edge of a sleek, modern sofa, the plush fabric a stark contrast to the turmoil churning within her. He stood at the window, a dark silhouette against the glittering backdrop, his back to her. The silence hung heavy, thick with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. Just moments ago, the truth had shattered the fragile foundation she'd built around her life, the truth about her father, about Lin Zixuan, about everything. Her mind felt like a fractured mirror, reflecting distorted images of the past. Lu Zizhan turned, his face partially obscured by the shadows. "Jiang Kehua," he said, his voice low and resonant, a timbre that always seemed to vibrate within her very core. He crossed the room, the faint click of his shoes on the hardwood echoing in the stillness. Kehua watched him, her heart a trapped bird fluttering against her ribs. He stopped in front of her, the city lights now illuminating his face, revealing the sharp angles of his jaw, the intensity in his eyes. He looked different. Less guarded, perhaps. More vulnerable. What is he going to say? She wondered, a knot tightening in her stomach. What can he possibly say after all of this? Lu Zizhan began, then hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. He reached out, his hand hovering just above hers before he gently cupped her cheek. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver down her spine. 12 years, he murmured, his thumb tracing the curve of her jawline. 12 years you've carried this burden. Kehua closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the sudden intimacy of the gesture. His touch felt right. Unexpectedly so. Yet, the confusion remained, a tangled web of unanswered questions and burgeoning emotions. How can he understand? She thought, her mind still reeling from the revelations. How can he possibly grasp the depth of my pain? I know it's not easy, he continued, his voice soft, almost a whisper. What you've endured, what your family has endured, he paused, his gaze searching hers. I want to help you, Kehua. Not just with your father, but with everything. Kehua opened her eyes, her gaze locking with his. The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch in her throat. Help me? She thought, a bitter laugh threatening to escape her lips. He thinks he can help me. He thinks he can fix this. Lu Zizhan lowered his hand, his fingers brushing lightly against hers. I care about you, Kehua. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. He drew a sharp breath, as if steeling himself for something. More than I ever thought possible. Kehua's heart skipped a beat. Care about me? The words echoed in her mind, dislodging something deep within her. A feeling she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge, a feeling she had buried beneath layers of anger and resentment. Don't, she whispered, her voice trembling. Don't say things you don't mean. She pulled her hand away, the loss of his touch leaving a strange emptiness in its wake. She stood up, needing to put distance between them, needing to escape the intensity of his gaze. She walked towards the window, her reflection a ghost-like figure against the city lights. He doesn't understand, she told herself, the words a bitter mantra. He can't possibly understand what it's like to lose everything, to have your life ripped apart. Kehua, Lu Zizhan said, his voice laced with a mixture of pain and something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. He followed her, stopping just behind her. Don't push me away. Let me in. His breath warmed the back of her neck, sending a wave of goosebumps down her arms. She closed her eyes, fighting the urge to turn around, to face him, to fall into the comforting embrace she knew he would offer. I love you, Jiang Kehua. The words hung in the air, fragile yet unwavering. Kehua's breath hitched. She turned slowly, her eyes wide with disbelief. He loves me. The thought felt alien, impossible. Yet, there it was, hanging between them, raw and exposed. She searched his face, looking for any sign of deception, any hint of manipulation. But there was none. Only sincerity, a depth of emotion she had never seen before. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched his cheek. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing as he savored the contact. I know it's a lot to take in, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. But I promise you, Kahwa. I'll be here for you. Always. He opened his eyes, his gaze locking with hers. Let me help you rebuild your life. Let me build a future with you. The dam within her finally broke. The years of pain, of anger, of loneliness, poured out in a torrent of tears. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight as she sobbed against his chest. She clung to him, her fingers digging into his back, as if afraid to let go. For the first time in 12 years, Kahwa felt a glimmer of hope. A possibility of a future she never thought possible. A future with him. When her tears finally subsided, she pulled back slightly, her gaze searching his. What about everything else, she whispered, the words barely audible. My father Zhang Tianji, everything that's happened. Lu Zhizhan cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away the remnants of her tears. We'll face it together, he said, his voice firm, unwavering. I'll help you find the answers you seek. I'll protect you from those who would harm you. He leaned in, his breath warm against her lips. We'll face it all together. And then, he kissed her. The kiss was soft, tentative at first, then deepening, becoming more urgent, more passionate. It was a kiss that spoke of promises, of shared pain, of a future yet to be written. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, binding them together in a way she never thought possible. As they stood there, locked in an embrace, the city lights painting a kaleidoscope of colors across the glass, Kahwa knew that everything had changed. The past still haunted her, the shadows still lingered, but for the first time, she saw a light in the darkness. A light that was Lu Zhizhan. A light that promised a future together.